By the time he died in 1931, Thomas Edison had gathered 1,093 patents on inventions ranging from batteries to telephones to the most renowned invention that we all know of, the light bulb. Now you probably think that we're going to spend the episode talking about the light bulb like every other video out there on Thomas Edison, but actually we're going to spend today talking about the telephone. Now, everybody knows that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, but very few people know that he and Thomas Edison actually had a bit of a competition amongst themselves. First, we need to understand the character of Thomas Edison before we get into this little story. So, Thomas Edison was an absolute work addict. He would work day in and night. There's even a story that on his wedding day, he worked past midnight, leaving his new wife all alone that entire day. He was a bit of a celebrity. He often was in the newspapers, and at some point he actually had groupies that would follow him around. They'd be infatuated with him, and they would wait outside his invention factory and all this kind of stuff. This ultimately made his ego quite large, and he wanted to make sure that nobody ever beat him. So in 1876, when Graham Bell invented the very first telephone, Thomas Edison was furious. Graham Bell had just basically one-upped him, and he couldn't have it. He just couldn't stand knowing that there was another inventor that had invented something that was supposedly so revolutionary. So while Alexander Graham Bell did invent the telephone, the first edition of the telephone was terrible. A person's voice would be very muffled, almost not understandable, and the further the transmission went, the more it got muffled. It was unusable. So, sure, Alexander Graham Bell invented a telephone, but it was kind of a trashy telephone and wasn't very useful for most people. And so, Graham Bell and Edison knew that they needed to make this a more viable product, and the thing that was going to do that was improving the transmitter so that it could pick up the voice and it could send it further so that it could actually be applicable. And so the two of them got to inventing. This was a race against time. The transmitter is made up of two main components, the hard casing and the diaphragm. So iterating on these things was what they had to do. They had to improve on the hard casing, they had to improve on the diaphragm to basically figure out what the best transmitter was going to look like. Graham Bell took an academic approach. He thought through the theory, he thought, how do I improve this? He would create iterations, but it would go at a slower pace. He was much more thoughtful. He gave much more thought to each transmitter that he did. On the other hand, Edison didn't care. He went through every possible material he could think of, and he just tested an absurd amount of transmitters. He left no material untested. He even went as far as to use pig bladder in one of the iterations. So, he didn't give as much thought or wasn't as intellectual with each approach, but he made far more transmitters and tested far more of them than Alexander Graham Bell. Eventually, Edison had his best transmitter and Graham had his best, and Western Union, who was the biggest cable company at the time, decided to do a little PR campaign. They were going to do Edison versus Graham Bell. Whose transmitter is the best? They put them up beside each other, put them up face to face, and sure enough, Edison blows Graham Bell out of the park. Edison's transmitter could pick up a whisper from 3 meters and transmit it over 70 miles away, whereas Graham Bell's new and upgraded transmitter could barely pick up a shout and send it even 10 miles. And so Edison's transmitter was adopted, and it was used in the early versions of the telephone, and Edison's ego is as high as ever, and he still believed he was the best inventor in the world, and basically one-upped Graham Bell in his own invention. Now I want to slow down and pick apart this story a little bit. Edison was never the smartest guy in the world. In fact, Alexander Graham Bell was probably a lot smarter than he was. Graham Bell understood telephones more, he was better at physics, he was far more of an academic and an intellectual. But what made Edison so great was that he was the first to come to action. Edison was not afraid of failure. In fact, failure was never a concern of his. In 1914, Edison's invention factory, where he would spend all his time inventing and where he literally had all the equipment that he needed to bring anything to life, burned down. And as the factory burned down, his son Charles runs up to him, and in a calm voice, Edison says, "Charlie, go and get your mother and friends. They will never be able to see a spectacular fire like this in their entire life." His son was confused, and when he asked about it, Edison said, "Yeah, our factory is being burned down to ashes." And all the mistakes we have made so far in the factory are also being burned down to ashes. We will start over again tomorrow. Edison did not try to fight failure. He never tried to make everything perfect. He just wanted results, and he figured out early on that the way to getting results was through fast iteration, figuring out what didn't work. That's the way to figuring out the best solution. So I want to ask you, how many times have you held yourself back from something great because you were afraid of failure? I can tell you that for myself, there's so many opportunities that I didn't go after. So many times I was stuck in analysis paralysis. I would spend all my time thinking about things, thinking about how to make it perfect, thinking about how to make it just right. But that stopped me from taking action. And because I never took action, I never had that success that I was looking for. So for today's homework, I want you to think about something that you're afraid of failing at. Perhaps it's sending out a sales email to a new client. Maybe it's trying out for a sports team. Maybe it's cooking a meal for a friend. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But it's something that you're afraid at failing at, and that's the thing that's been holding you back. And I want you to open up your calendar, your reminders app, or write it down on a piece of paper. I don't care. But set a date within the next 2 days. Set a date and a time where you're going to do this task. Even if you fail, even if it doesn't work out, I want you to take your shot. And I'm going to be joining you guys on this challenge as well. For me, personally, I'm afraid of failing on this specific grant proposal that I'm working on right now. And so my commitment, and I'm putting it out there right now, is that despite me overthinking, and I've been overthinking it and trying to figure out and make it perfect, but within the next 2 days, I'm going to give my best shot, do this grant proposal, and send it out, regardless of the outcome. Thank you guys for tuning in today. Now go out there, set yourselves apart.